A quiet morning in San Rafael, California, a peaceful suburb where the Fisher family was preparing for a fresh start in their homeland of Sweden. But within the walls of their home, something unimaginable was about to unfold. On November 7th, 1973, Nina Nadine Fisher's life was brutally taken in a crime so shocking it would remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. She was a devoted mother, loved by everyone who knew her. But on that fateful day, the world lost a bright light, and her family was plunged into a nightmare that would haunt them for years. Today, we unravel the mystery of what really happened inside that house, and how, after almost 50 years, the killer was finally brought to justice. Nina Nadine Fisher, a 31-year-old Swedish national, was living what seemed to be an idyllic life in San Rafael. Married and raising a 2-year-old daughter, Nina and her husband had built a comfortable life in the United States. They were preparing to return to Sweden, driven by a desire to raise their daughter closer to family and within their native culture. Nina's life in the U.S. had its challenges, as is often the case for young families living abroad. Yet, she was known among her friends and neighbors as a warm, caring individual who was deeply dedicated to her family. Her husband, working long hours to provide for them, often left Nina to manage the household and care for their daughter alone. November 7th, 1973 began like any other day. Nina was at home in their unincorporated San Rafael residence, likely going about her usual routine. Her 2-year-old daughter was with her, a constant companion in their peaceful home. But by the end of that day, this peaceful suburban home would become the scene of a horrifying crime that would haunt her family and community for decades. At some point during the day, an intruder entered the Fisher home. The exact time and manner of entry remain unclear, but what followed was a brutal and senseless attack. Nina was overpowered and sexually assaulted in what investigators would later describe as a violent struggle. The assailant, showing no mercy, then shot Nina 3 times, leaving her lifeless body inside the home. The scene was chaotic, and it was evident to investigators that Nina had fought fiercely against her attacker. Her body bore the signs of a struggle, indicating that she had tried desperately to protect herself and her daughter. Despite the ferocity of the assault, her daughter was miraculously unharmed, though she would later be found in the house near her mother's body. Nina's husband returned home after a long day at work, only to walk into a nightmarish scene. His immediate reaction was one of disbelief, quickly followed by a frantic call to the authorities. The Marin County Sheriff's Office responded rapidly, and the investigation into Nina's murder began immediately. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, hoping to find someone who might have seen or heard something unusual. However, the suburban setting provided little in the way of witnesses. The home was not in a densely populated area, and the timing of the attack, during the day when many neighbors would have been at work, meant that there were few, if any, people around who might have noticed the intruder. Forensics teams scoured the crime scene, collecting what little evidence they could find. This was the early 1970s, and forensic technology was not as advanced as it is today. Still, they hoped that some physical evidence, perhaps fingerprints or fibers, might lead them to Nina's killer. Despite their efforts, the evidence was sparse, and the clues that might have pointed to the perpetrator were frustratingly few. Investigators also explored the possibility that the crime could have been premeditated, possibly linked to the couple's impending move back to Sweden. However, they found no clear motives or connections that could explain why someone would target Nina so brutally. The investigation quickly stalled, with no strong suspects and no clear direction to pursue. The case was further complicated by the fact that the Fisher family was not originally from the area, and their social circle in California was relatively small. This limited the pool of potential suspects, as investigators found themselves with few leads and even fewer witnesses who could provide useful information. Days turned into weeks, and as the investigation struggled to gain traction, hope for a quick resolution began to fade. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the lack of evidence, led to growing frustration within the law enforcement community and deep despair for Nina's family. Despite the best efforts of the detectives assigned to the case, the trail grew colder with each passing day. By the end of 1973, the investigation had reached a standstill. Without new leads or breakthroughs, the case was eventually relegated to the cold case files, where it would remain for nearly 5 decades, a haunting reminder of a crime that had gone unpunished and a life that had been cruelly taken. Nevertheless, Nina's family, both in the United States and Sweden, never gave up hope that justice would eventually be served. They kept in regular contact with the Marin County Sheriff's Office, but as the years went by, it became increasingly difficult to maintain optimism. The pain of losing Nina was compounded by the frustration of not knowing who was responsible for her death or why. By the early 21st century, advances in forensic science had revolutionized the way cold cases were investigated. In 2021, nearly 50 years after Nina Nadine Fisher's murder, the Marin County Sheriff's Office decided to take advantage of these technological advancements. They sent the case to the California Department of Justice's Familial Search Program, a cutting-edge initiative designed to find potential suspects by comparing DNA evidence from crime scenes with profiles in national databases. This program was specifically designed to generate investigative leads for cases that had gone cold, where traditional methods had been exhausted. Months of analysis followed, as forensic experts carefully re-examined the DNA evidence collected from the Fisher crime scene. This included any biological material that might have been left behind by the perpetrator during the brutal assault. The hope was that advancements in DNA analysis, which had improved significantly since the 1970s, would now be able to provide a match where previous efforts had failed. In late 2021, the Familial Search Program finally delivered a breakthrough. A partial DNA match was found, linking the crime scene evidence to a potential suspect's family. This discovery led investigators to Michael Eugene Mullen, a resident of Idaho. Mullen, who had never been on law enforcement's radar for this crime, was now the prime suspect in a murder that had remained unsolved for nearly 5 decades. The identification of Mullen marked a significant turning point in the investigation. However, the process was far from over. Law enforcement needed to build a case against Mullen that would stand up in court. This required not only confirming the DNA match, but also gathering additional evidence to establish his presence at the crime scene and his involvement in the crime. Over the next 3 years, investigators from the Marin County Sheriff's Office, in collaboration with the Marin County District Attorney's Office, worked meticulously to solidify their case against Mullen. The case was complex and challenging, but the investigators were driven by the prospect of finally bringing closure to Nina's family. By 2024, the case against Mullen was strong enough to warrant an arrest. On August 14, 2024, nearly 51 years after the brutal murder of Nina Nadine Fisher, justice seemed finally within reach with the arrest of Michael Eugene Mullen. Mullen, now 75 years old, had lived a quiet life in Idaho, far removed from the California community that had been rocked by Nina's murder in 1973. But the relentless march of technology and the perseverance of law enforcement had finally caught up with him. When DNA evidence linked Mullen to the crime, law enforcement agencies from California to Idaho collaborated to bring him into custody. The operation was carefully coordinated to ensure that Mullen was apprehended without incident, a testament to the meticulous planning and cooperation between the various agencies involved. Mullen was arrested near the town of Salmon, Idaho, a small community where he had resided for several years. The arrest was conducted by officers from the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office, with support from the Idaho State Police and investigators from Marin County. Given the passage of time and Mullen's advanced age, the arrest was a relatively low-key affair, devoid of the drama often associated with such operations. Nonetheless, it was a moment of significant emotional weight for all those involved. Following his arrest, Mullen was transported to the Lemhi County Jail, where he was booked pending extradition proceedings. The legal process required to bring him back to California was set in motion, with Mullen facing charges for the murder of Nina Nadine Fisher. As Mullen awaited extradition to California, questions remained about what might emerge during the legal proceedings. Would Mullen confess to the crime? What had motivated the brutal attack on Nina? And would the trial bring to light any new details about what happened on that fateful day in November 1973? These were the questions that hung in the air as the case moved into its next phase, with the promise of finally answering the mysteries that had lingered for so long. Joel Gerhardt was a well-known and respected figure in his Katy, Texas community. At 37, he had established a quiet life for himself, marked by his openness about his sexual orientation in a time and place where such openness was not always met with understanding or acceptance. Despite potential challenges, Joel remained true to himself, engaging with his neighbors and maintaining a peaceful, if somewhat solitary existence. As a man who valued his privacy, Joel's day-to-day life was marked by routine and stability. He had a close-knit circle of friends and was generally seen as someone who kept to himself, but was always kind and approachable. There were no apparent signs of trouble or conflict in his life. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but behind closed doors, an encounter was set to unfold that would disrupt this quiet life forever. Investigators later uncovered that Gerhardt had crossed paths with Guillermo Alejandro Castillo and Jordan Bolanos, two men with troubled pasts. The exact circumstances of how Gerhardt met Castillo and Bolanos remain unclear, but it is believed that the interaction occurred shortly before the night of the murder. Castillo, who had a history of violence, seemed to have formed some sort of relationship or connection with Gerhardt. Whether brief or fleeting, it was enough to lead to a deadly confrontation. On the night of the murder, Castillo and Bolanos went to Gerhardt's home. The details of what transpired inside remain murky, but what is certain is that the meeting turned violent. Castillo later claimed that Gerhardt had made unwanted advances toward him, an assertion that authorities would later scrutinize as possibly being a pretext to justify the brutal attack. After brutally assaulting Joel Gerhardt, Guillermo Castillo and Jordan Bolanos quickly turned their attention to covering their tracks. In a hurried attempt to stage the crime scene, they ransacked Gerhardt's home, stealing his television and loading it into his car, which they then drove away. Their intent appeared clear: to make the incident look like a robbery gone wrong, hoping to mislead investigators and delay any serious scrutiny of their actions. However, their sloppy efforts left behind a trail of evidence. Authorities quickly linked the stolen car to the crime, and within a short period, Castillo was apprehended while driving Gerhardt's vehicle. The discovery of Gerhardt's television in the trunk was damning, further solidifying Castillo's connection to the murder. Bolanos was also swiftly captured, and both men were charged with capital murder. The crime was deemed particularly heinous, not only because of the violence involved, but also due to the suspicion that it was fueled by animosity toward Gerhardt's sexual orientation. Despite the overwhelming evidence against them, Castillo and Bolanos' case would take an unexpected turn, introducing complications that would extend the case far beyond its initial resolution. While in custody, Castillo took advantage of a critical error made by U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, now known as ICE. Despite being a prime suspect in a heinous crime, Castillo was mistakenly deported to Colombia. This deportation occurred because Castillo claimed he was a legal alien, not a U.S. citizen, and due to bureaucratic oversight, federal officers failed to detain him for the murder charges pending against him. Castillo's escape was nothing short of a legal and administrative blunder. After being deported, he cut off all ties with the United States, vanishing into Colombia, where he would remain a fugitive for over 2 decades. The mistake left Gerhardt's family devastated, as they were forced to come to terms with the fact that the man responsible for their loved one's death had effectively escaped justice. The case went cold, with authorities having no success in tracking Castillo down. In December 2022, after years of silence, the Joel Gerhardt case saw a remarkable turn of events. Guillermo Castillo, who had been living under the radar in Colombia, inadvertently walked back into the hands of U.S. law enforcement. The break came when Castillo, seeking to renew his travel documents, approached the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá for a visa. Unbeknownst to him, his name triggered red flags in the embassy system, leading to his arrest by Colombian authorities. This unexpected capture brought renewed hope to the Gerhardt family and the community that had long awaited justice. However, the process of extraditing Castillo back to the United States was far from simple. Legal hurdles and concerns over the potential for the death penalty delayed the process for months. It wasn't until the charge was downgraded from capital murder to regular murder that Colombia agreed to extradite Castillo. In August 2024, Castillo was finally flown back to U.S. Upon landing in Houston, Castillo was immediately taken into custody and faced with the charges of murder that had eluded him for so many years. The court proceedings began with Castillo's first appearance, where the details of the 1998 murder were recounted. The prosecution highlighted the brutality of the crime and Castillo's subsequent escape from justice, emphasizing the need for accountability after so many years. Castillo, now in his 50s, seemed a shadow of the man who had committed the crime, but the weight of his actions remained undeniable. As the trial moves forward, the courtroom is where the past is confronted and justice is sought. The Gerhardt family and the community are waiting for the verdict, hoping that justice will finally be served. Stay tuned for updates on the trial as we get closer to seeing how this long-awaited case concludes. If you find this video compelling, show your support by giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated about the latest investigations and mysteries. Your support means the world to us as we continue to pursue the truth in the world of cold cases.